Good afternoon. Hello and welcome to the final webinar in the 2023-2024 FCM Collective series. Today's session is entitled Creative Collaboration for Climate Adaptation, Innovative Models for Community Resilience. FCM is pleased to work in collaboration with our partners, the cooperators, to present this discussion today. My name is Evan Clark, and I'm the Manager of Partnerships and Sponsorships at FCM, and I'm looking forward to this latest episode in our ongoing exploration of adaptation and climate resilience financing. These forward-thinking investments are crucial to build a stronger Canada and one that is prepared to face the increasing risks and challenges associated with the changing climate. As we move forward with our commitment to reconciliation, I want to acknowledge that FCM's head office is located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. As an organization, FCM endeavors to unlearn colonial mindsets and practices, grow in knowledge, and adapt our ways of working. As we continue to build meaningful relationships, we recognize the historic and ongoing contributions of Indigenous peoples and honor their leadership and partnership in shaping and strengthening communities across the country. I welcome you all to acknowledge the land you are joining us from. Now, before I turn things over to the experts, I have just a few housekeeping items to mention. L'interprétation simultanée est disponible pour notre session aujourd'hui. Pour accéder à l'audio, have I been muted the entire time? Okay. I must have hit the space bar. Excuse me. L'interprétation simultanée est disponible pour notre session aujourd'hui. Pour accéder à l'audio français, il faut simplement cliquer la petite icône du globe au bas de l'écran vers la droite et sélectionner le français. If you do not select a language, you will hear audio in English. Je vous donne quelques secondes pour faire le choix de langue. If you would like to ask a question today, please post your questions in the chat. If time allows, I will help facilitate a brief Q&A by pulling your questions directly from the chat at the end of the session. Finally, please note this session is being recorded and will be available on demand on the FCM website. I would now like to introduce you to our moderator for today's session. Don Iveson served as Edmonton's 35th mayor from 2013 to 2021 with a guiding leadership principle to make things better for the next generation. This long-term view is now embedded in Edmonton's Smart Growth City Plan, City Council's Energy Transition Strategy, and Edmonton's nation-leading work on stormwater management and climate adaptation. He now works with cooperators as executive advisor for climate investment and community resilience, and he is also ramping up Civic Good, a public policy advisory practice working on climate, housing, governance, and civic innovation projects with like-minded clients ranging from startups to governments. He has accepted an appointment as a School of Cities Canadian Urban Leader at the University of Toronto and volunteers as board co-chair of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Over to you, Don.
Well, merci, Evan. It's great to be with friends here from across the country, coast to coast to coast. I'll begin just by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree, the Dene, the Saulteaux, the Blackfoot, and of course, Métis Nation Zone 4, and one of the largest communities for Inuit Canadians south of the Arctic Circle. So reconciliation is an important part of all of these conversations around climate resilience and land stewardship. There was just a phenomenal report released last week on Indigenous interpretations, knowledge, and impacts of climate change in Canada. That's worth a look, because in the far north, these issues are further advanced and more devastating already, and offer a preview of some of the challenges that people around the world will face, but particularly Canadians, being a northern nation, are going to face. And it reminds us that we all have a role in being good stewards of the land, the air, and the water that each of our communities depends on for life and for flourishing. So with that respectful acknowledgement, I'll turn to welcoming our knowledge keepers for this exercise, which are Ewa Jackson, the Managing Director from ICLEI Canada, who's been a key collaborator for some of the work that we've been doing together around adaptation finance, and you're going to hear a little bit more from her about that today. Shannon Miedema, who's the Director of Energy and Environment at the Regional Municipality of our Halifax Regional Municipality, and she's on the front lines of some extraordinary changing weather in Atlantic Canada. So we appreciate Shannon being here to talk about what that's like, but more importantly, what they're going to do about it. And my colleague Paul Manias from Addenda Capital, who is a special advisor for climate resilient infrastructure and has a deep infrastructure investing background from OMERS. So he's invested some of your money on this call in things ranging from nuclear power to water desalination plants. So Paul has deep infrastructure finance knowledge that he's going to bring to this conversation today. So as we all know, municipal infrastructure is extraordinary in scope, especially in this country where the burden is so great on municipalities to maintain so much with such few resources. And the financial challenges that I hear about from mayors and councillors who I keep in touch with and friends at FCM have only grown in recent years with the financial challenges that have cascaded from the pandemic, from the cost of doing business going up, and from the disruption to communities and ways of doing business. So it's a bit of a perfect storm, if you will, of aging infrastructure. We made some progress on the infrastructure deficit, but now the question is that infrastructure that exists adapted to the challenges of tomorrow? And what about all of the infrastructure we have yet to build to support housing growth and to build stronger and more inclusive and healthier communities? Is that future infrastructure being built with the weather for the next 100 years or whatever the life cycle of that infrastructure is taken to heart at the design stage and at the financing stage? Because that may present some opportunities to deliver infrastructure differently in ways that materialize building it right against savings either upfront or especially over time to projects and communities that are more resilient to the challenges that we see already today and that lie ahead in any climate scenario. So those climate-related risks are on the rise. We see both uninsured and insured losses continuing to mount from flood, from fire, and more and more knowledge about the impacts of severe fire on air quality, which is now becoming an issue for both outdoor and indoor air quality, and runs a bit at odds with some of the work that we've done to make our buildings more energy efficient. Now we're colliding with challenges with air turnover rates and filtration in order to deal with PM 2.5. And so managing the climate challenges is not getting easier, but within that complexity comes more opportunities for innovation and the need to partner ever more creatively to rise to the challenges that are coming at us. The most important thing, I think, to start with is that unmanaged risk is the most expensive. And ICLEI has done some extraordinary work on pricing the cost of inaction, which is the most expensive path forward. So by being here today, you have already taken some action and taken some responsibility to say, we know that that inaction is not the right strategy and is going to cost us more, and that proactive investments in resilience and adaptation, as well as ongoing efforts to mitigate and reduce emissions so that we can reduce the amount of warming that we're going to have to face, that this is smart business for your municipality and for your community. So the art then for us that we're going to dive into a little bit today is finding ways to make those benefits of undertaking preventative investment tangible in the community context in ways that will help make the case for further investment and hopefully in certain cases help pay for that investment. So to get into that a little bit deeper, I'm going to turn first to Ewa Jackson, who has been, again, an extraordinary partner for us in leading something we call the FRIP project, the Financing Resilient Infrastructure project. And so she's in a position to highlight some examples of the sort of resilience infrastructure projects municipalities across the country have been considering. And she's got some great descriptive statistics on the perils being protected against, project sizes, and so on and so forth. And I'm hoping that this will inspire the audience on the sorts of projects that you might consider in your own municipalities. So over to you, Ewa, and welcome.
Thanks so much, Don. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge that I am calling in from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, or what I am lucky enough to call home as Toronto. So thank you to them for the stewardship over the land, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. As Don mentioned, we were lucky enough to partner with the cooperators over the course of 2023 to run a project to think about financing resilient infrastructure projects and the variety of ways that that can happen through. So we worked with 10 municipalities, and I'm so happy that one of them is here. So thanks, Shannon from Halifax, for joining, to ideate what are the risks and hazards they are facing, and a possible pipeline of projects, resilient infrastructure projects, I should say. So not the policy options and not the operational projects that necessarily need to happen, but the hard infrastructure projects that could help address those risks. A core component of the project, though, was not to only work with the sustainability or the climate practitioners, but to connect them with their own financial colleagues, because we know sometimes people work alongside each other and cross paths occasionally, but not as often as would be fruitful for these types of projects, as well as to connect them to financial experts from both the public sector as well as the private sector. So we had an ambitious plot ahead of us, an ambitious project, and we, in the end, were able to come up with 22 possible resilient infrastructure projects that were identified and prepared for financing through the project, and a little bit more on that, as well as having those projects address 18 unique climate hazards. So our partners were scattered across the country, and because of that, identified projects that addressed a variety of hazards, some unique to our coasts, others unique to our inland prairie ecosystems, as well as everything in between. And just at a very high level, these projects address, the things that we can all imagine that we faced: flood resilience, water and wastewater system resilience, wildfire resilience, even some around energy system resilience and avoiding brownouts and outages, as well as broader resilient community planning. And the projects really were quite diverse in terms of the types of asset types or infrastructure types that they sought to implement. And so a little bit on that, we had what was nice to see is we had a mix of traditional gray infrastructure as well as this emerging field of low impact development and the use of nature-based solutions, projects that were designed as to be preparatory and to be build preparedness around emergency response, and not just in the response phase, flood protection, dam stabilization, and there is some interesting lessons learned, I think, through that. And maybe that's where I'd like to spend a little bit of our time in that. What did we learn through doing this? And I should mention that what the participants did was they created these project profiles, which were a way to summarize the core information about the project, as well as some of the nuanced information required to identify private financing for these projects. And so what we learned in doing this project is around that idea of getting all hands on deck. Thinking about innovative financing around resilience requires many players at the table. It involves bringing in colleagues from climate divisions, engineering, and finance early in the process as a way to make it most likely to yield success. Each of these professions approach resilient infrastructure from a different perspective, and bringing them together early, you can ideate and design projects that together will help to lead to critical success of implementation. The next piece is something that Don alluded to, which is really thinking about the direct and indirect benefits. When we think about resilient infrastructure, we must consider who benefits both indirectly and indirectly from that protection. And understanding that, it's when you start to realize how this infrastructure can be paid for. We've talked a lot about within the project team and around the project participants, how much language matters and how much words matter. So one of our lessons learned is this idea of really building a collective language around risk and risk treatment and risk transfer and all the things associated with that. We need to get people on the same page in the way we talk about funding and financing. In investment terms, this is often referred to as a taxonomy, but I think at a smaller scale, we need to build some collective language around those ideas of risk transfer, financing, private capital, on all of those terms. If we want to make progress on innovative financing, we need to be speaking the same language day to day. The other piece is, while we through this project saw the need to explore private financing for resilient infrastructure, we're not trying to suggest that it should replace all traditional sources of funding for municipal infrastructure. We ideated around this notion of a hierarchy of money, and that naturally pursuing funding from federal, provincial, territorial governments first should happen. If you imagine a triangle, right? This is so-called free money, and should be a first place to turn to. Then in that middle of the triangle, there's more traditional sources of concessionary capital, so low interest loans and such. And then in the broadest part of the triangle, consider moving towards private capital. When you visualize it at that triangle, I think it also becomes clear that there isn't enough money at the top of the triangle to meet the scale of the infrastructure investment required, as well as the scale and speed of climate change. And so we need to broaden that triangle and not all be working only to the public money at the top. And I think ultimately what we learned is summarized through the adage I say to my daughter all the time, which is hard things are hard. And while this work is difficult, it's difficult to understand and unlock what those potential mechanisms are to finance resilient infrastructure. We also learned that through slow, progressive work, it is doable by bringing the right people together early in a process, while also opening our collective minds to doing things differently. Innovative financing for resilient infrastructure becomes somewhat more achievable. It takes some courage and it takes an openness to collective learning, but it can be done. So in that spirit, through this project, not only did we work to support the participants in it, those 10 municipalities, but we wanted to create a toolkit that anyone could use. And this is the main resource that we saw as an output that could be used one-to-many. And so while the link to the toolkit, available in both English and French, is being put into the chat, I'll just spend 1 minute describing what's in it. So the toolkit is comprised of a few elements. The first of which is a collection of examples from the FRIP project. So these are short, not quite case studies, but case stories of the project that are presented in a uniform way that can be used to not only showcase the range of possible projects, but also to do what Dawn is suggesting, to sort of stir up that creativity around designing your own resilient infrastructure projects. And the next elements are really the toolkit portion. So there's the project ideation guide, which is an editable Excel spreadsheet, which is meant to be used as a first step in the process of getting resilient infrastructure projects ready for financing in your community. So the spreadsheet is designed to guide you through that process of identifying and prioritizing a long list of projects. That prioritization piece is important. How does one get from this long list of 12, 15 projects to one that is a bit more manageable? And so there's a tab in that Excel file that's meant to assist you in doing that. And then the last portion is meant to be used in tandem, which is the project preparation template. In order to create this template, we looked at the major infrastructure funds and identified what are the questions that are common to these funds. We thought that this would be a great proxy for what do you need to know about your projects in order to get them financed or funded through a traditional public source. And so we've created both the template as well as instructions that should be used in tandem to help you complete that. We thought this serves two purposes. One, if you are pursuing conversations with private investors, this resource could be valuable in terms of thinking through what is that return on investment, who are those beneficiaries, both direct and indirect, and some of that other thinking one needs to go through, as well as we hear in budget 2024, April 16th is circled on my calendar. When funds start to roll out through more public sources, these templates, if they're prepared in time, are a great first step in completing an application for some of those other more traditional sources of funding. So all of those are available in the links that are being put into the chat, and I'm happy to talk more about them, as well as some more specifics from within the project. Thanks, Don.
Thanks, Eva. And getting municipalities ready for coming funding of all sorts, the free money that we know is important, but will probably not cover all of the needs that we have, and then the creativity to lever that into different creative partnerships. We really appreciate the work that ICLEI's done with the 11 municipalities in the project to help codify these learnings, and thank you for presenting on those just now. Now, Shannon, you were part of this work. You were one of the practitioners at the table, and so some of what was just distilled is knowledge you were able to help share with us. But curious, from your perspective, what are the most urgent needs? You've seen your share of severe weather and climate-related perils, unfortunately, in Halifax, particularly this last year, and in Atlantic Canada generally. So over the past year, what's on your mind when it comes to protecting Haligonians from physical climate risk through resilience infrastructure, and what did you learn through this work that we've been engaged in for the last year that you can share with us?
Thank you, Don. Happy to be here, and I'm coming to you all from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq people, looking out at Shabuktuk, which is the Mi'kmaq word for Great Harbor. And very excited to be hosting the Junos this week. We've got all things Junos, and we are greening the Junos as much as they're letting us, which is super exciting. And Mike, thanks for putting in the chat a really corny video that the mayor and myself and a colleague put together about some of the things we're doing. So that's the happy note. No, this has been a really great project to be a part of. And I think every government practitioner, everyone in climate kind of that is succeeding and making progress has the same kind of mentality of like being open-minded to new considerations, new potential things we can unlock, like problem solving together. And so I was really excited at the opportunity to be one of these participating cities and brainstorm with colleagues from across Canada, but also with ICLEI and cooperators and all these financial experts on this idea. And, in Halifax, our climate plan, Halifax actually calls for an investment collectively over the life of the plan, which goes to 2050, of $22 billion, and actually assumes that we're going to be, much, much better off through those 30 years for the investment, both on mitigation and adaptation, by an additional $22 billion collectively. But we know we can't do all of this on the backs of individual property tax payers, or even, public as tax payers across Canada. So I think this is a fascinating topic. And I think that, Don, you're going to talk about some interesting projects, but yeah, I really hope that we can figure out some ways to leverage the triangle that Eva talked about in the ways that we need to going forward. So yeah, in Halifax, we unfortunately had, a hurricane, a massive wildfire, and some really intense flash flooding in the last year. And if anything, it's brought to attention of some of, senior leadership and other key partners in our community, the need to act more urgently on climate generally, but also to focus more intentionally on adaptation that may have been done in the past. And luckily, our plan is half mitigation and half adaptation. And we've been doing a lot of foundational work to be able to figure out how to even prioritize in any type of way that makes sense our critical infrastructure and how to build resilience into it. So we have taken the latest IPCC climate science from the assessment report number 6 and downscaled it locally. And then we've done updated flood risk mapping for our entire community on land and in the water, coastal, pluvial, fluvial, with a consultant that's just completed now. And we've also done some other climate hazard mapping for other hazards. And then we're looking at doing some rapid condition assessments of that critical infrastructure, figuring out who owns it if it's not us, because it's all connected and dependent on each other. So that's a whole big conversation with stakeholders like other levels of government, CN Rail, power utilities, et cetera. But we're also trying to layer in vulnerability and looking at social considerations. And so looking at the census data that's available so that we can look at where are our pieces of critical infrastructure that we own and control that are most at risk from a climate perspective, and also in a place of higher vulnerability, because that's where we think we'd like to start. And that's the intention of our climate plan, is to really be equity focused and prioritizing vulnerability first and foremost with our investments. And luckily we have some dollars, because here our council approved a climate action tax, which I hate the word, but basically agreed to strongly invest in climate action through property tax increases 2 years ago. So we've been sucking away some money specifically for resilient critical infrastructure. And but it's hard to, we want defensible decisions, we want to be transparent, we want to leverage funding, obviously. So the good part is that, you know, we're really making progress in that kind of process. And we're not just waiting to do projects. We also took the opportunity to apply to the Natural Infrastructure Fund that Infrastructure Canada had put out. And we're doing a green infrastructure, natural infrastructure project on an eroding coastal road on the Dartmouth side of Halifax. That's about a $5 million project, which will work to dissipate some of the wave action that undermines the guardrail and the road, which is a really important road and part of an evacuation route here. I can talk for a couple more minutes, or do you want me to stop, Don?
If you've got any other examples you think would be particularly relevant, given the diversity of folks on the call here, feel free.
Yeah, just a couple other things with, you know, flooding. We're really hoping to do a buyout program of some properties that need to be really turned into, you know, natural parkland, and we could use some green infrastructure as part of it. But the other big piece of what I think is needed outside of money is partnership. And as city governments, we really need our other government partners to play with us on things like provincial or federal buyout programs. And I know a lot of cities in Canada that have had success with these. The province has been a willing partner, and then there's been funding flowing from often the federal government. But here in Nova Scotia, unfortunately, there's not a willingness to participate with us on a buyout program in Halifax. So, you know, you can have all the money in the world, but if you can't get approval or partnership on some critical work, then that's a struggle as well.
Well, shakes fist at provincial government should have its own emoji. It doesn't yet, but one day it will. You know, and that's a great example of a situation where, you know, ideally all orders of government would be aligned and there would be a straightforward way to do this. And hopefully in future years, as this issue becomes sadly more urgent, that will get easier to access. But in the meantime, you know, situations like property buyouts, where the use of the land afterwards is a nature-based solution that has a park-like quality to it. You know, one of the models that we've been interested in, just by way of example, is opportunities to do land swaps, where a park requirement inland that may be a better place for housing could perhaps be swapped not too distantly to a land assembly in an area that's at risk, that at least for the foreseeable future and most of the time could be used as park space, but also buffer against sea level rise, king tides, and so on and so forth. So land swapping may be one of the one of the other ways to bring private capital to the table for kind of a multi-stakeholder solution, like the National Adaptation Strategy calls for whole of society partnerships. Well, that's a grand statement, and we do need those, but tangibly in the community setting, especially if you don't have senior orders of government coming to the table in helpful ways, that forces and unlocks some potential for creativity where there's shared value and value exchange that the private sector can assist with. And that's probably, I didn't plan it, but not a bad segue to what Paul is going to talk about here, which is a very tangible example of work that Cooperators has been doing in British Columbia that involves working on the private side of the property line, particularly. And when it's all public infrastructure, it makes sense that the bias would be to using the concessionary capital. But once you start thinking about impacts to private infrastructure and private properties, necessarily private finance comes into play, even at the level of home financing. And so I'm not going to steal Paul's thunder. I'm going to let him describe the tangible example where we've been doing this with a fellow FCM member, but I'll let Paul describe specifically what we've been up to, because we're quite proud of it. And I will just add one other point as part of the segue. I'm really glad Shannon mentioned the equity impacts of climate, and the Canadian Climate Institute has done quite a bit of analysis of, there's big numbers that say the Canadian economy will be down multiple percentage points of GDP if climate risk is unmanaged. But when you break that out into income quintiles, it's not even across the board. The people with the least means and the least incomes are the most impacted in those scenarios. And so having an equity lens on these issues in communities is critical, because sometimes it's the folks who have the least who get hit the worst. And so speaking of that, on that note, how can we help? Paul's going to talk to you a little bit about a project we've been working on over the last year.
Yeah, thanks, Don. So yeah, and as Don said, we actually didn't set this up, but the project that I'm going to describe, which started off at the end of last year in the village of Lytton, really does actually pull together all three of the comments from my fellow presenters. Starting off, in Eva's description of that hierarchy of money and where possible, the ability to leverage, grant and concessionary capital from different levels of government, through to being very sensitive on the equity lens side. If anyone knows the village of Lytton, a relatively kind of middle to lower income community that was hit with a devastating wildfire in 2021. Where effectively the whole village was wiped out, and almost all residents, both in the village and in surrounding areas, lost everything. And then lastly, in Don's thought about the land swaps, which is really an example, I think, of the need for kind of creative thinking. Not just for whole of society partnerships and the need to, where appropriate, bring together public and private sector, but also just in everyone's kind of efforts to apply a lens of creativity on challenges that are by their nature complex and therefore require kind of the creative solution. So I'll start off maybe, and I'll try and keep my remarks short, but I'll give you a little bit of a description of about Lytton, the way it was before Cooperators got involved, and then the program we put together, which we believe and have been getting positive feedback on, really is helping residents there who choose to return to the village to rebuild in a fire resilient and net zero way. So as noted, in June of 2021, Lytton got hit with a significant wildfire. The town was effectively lost. The federal government stepped in relatively quickly through one of the NRCan divisions, the Natural Resources Canada's Pacifican, which is the group of NRCan that represents the West, with a relatively generous package around incenting the rebuilding of homes for those homeowners who chose to return to the village and the surrounding areas, to rebuild their homes in both fire resilient and net zero way. And that was in many respects quite a generous program where the residents with again some forethought, credit to the federal government in this case, some forethought on design to really make the program easy to access. And again, going back to Shannon's point about the need to to really keep an eye on kind of social vulnerability and even just kind of state of place at the time, for a series of residents who just lost everything, to be, as Don well knows, because we speak, I'm the non-governmental person to his governmental person, so I'll say it now, which is, to be put upon with the typical government bureaucracy, and I'll use those in quotes intentionally, was something that the feds in this case really strove to avoid, and so they set up a really easy program around the ability to access funds. The one challenge, and so they put this program out, and unfortunately they got a relatively low uptake on the program, and the challenge was, for all their creativity, one of the elements that the program didn't address due to some structural concerns was the ability to get cash in hand in advance of building. So the federal government put in place a program which gave very generous funding, but only after completion and certification of the home rebuild to a standard of fire resilience and net zero. And again, done with, I would say, kind of good intentions and, kind of sound management of public funds, i.e. we don't want to grant the money in advance of knowing that it's actually been, spent in the right manner. However, given the situation on the ground and the socioeconomic status of many of the residents there, it was challenging to access. We got approached by ICLR, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, who flagged this as a challenge. Again, in this way of kind of saying, hey, here's the federal government who's designed a really interesting program, but it's not quite there. And so, we thought about it, Don and I and the team, and thought about whether or not there was a way to bring private capital in to kind of solve the challenge here. And this is an example, which I'll describe in a second, where it's not private capital actually supplanting public funds. In Eva's example, we are still, or the village is still utilizing the most effective capital that's out there, which is government concessionary capital in this case. But the private sector is actually stepping in with a mechanism that allows them to access it. The program's completely voluntary, and in effect, it's a bridge funding mechanism which works with both homeowners who want to participate as well as their builders, and sets in part a relatively complex structure, but it's a structure in which really seeks to respect the homeowners' situation. Again, having lost their homes, being of a low to mid socioeconomic status for the most part, not to burden them with, for example, traditional mortgages or liens on their homes or other property assets. But we designed this program in a way to really enable homeowners, again, who choose to return, to take advantage of these funds that are available for the government, by the government, the federal government, and rebuild their homes in a fire resilient net zero way. So we're happy to announce that the program was launched in December of last year. The federal government's program, which was due to expire this year, has actually been extended another year into 2025. So it allows more homeowners in Lytton to take advantage of it. We partnered actually with another, back to whole of society partnership. We actually partnered with a local credit union, Interior Savings Credit Union, now renamed Beam Credit Union after a recent merger, to help us facilitate some of the on-the-ground activities. And so we really started to stitch all these groups together. We've been working actively with the village on their social media sites to promote the access to this program. I'm happy to report we have 4 or 5 homeowners right now who are in the early stages of taking advantage of this, including, in touch wood, because this is early days, but including potentially extending the footprint of this program, not just to traditional stick-built houses, but also to manufactured housing. And, should this kind of continue, the hope is one day some of these net zero and fire resilient standards could actually be spec'd into manufactured housing, as a matter of just, of instance. So we're quite happy with the program. Again, it's an example of mixing both mitigation and adaptation. It's an ability to, when you have the opportunity to rebuild or to take action, to have a climate lens on and really try and do things in a way that considers, not just today, but inevitably what's happening as climate change, continues to exacerbate a lot of our physical climate risks, and to do so in a net zero manner as well. So we're really excited about the project. Lastly, I'll say, and then I'll turn it back to you, Don. We think that this is a good example and a good model of a project, again, where we can use creativity, to work with different orders of government or different parties and really extend out a benefit that, was kind of stuck in the system. So we're hopeful that we can do this in a number of different communities and in different ways across the country.
So sadly, there will be more communities, and there even were last year, including losses in Halifax and in West Kelowna, that are going to need rebuilding financing. And it's key to actually build new structures that can stand up to the perils. And one of the other things we were able to accomplish through this was get agreement from other insurers who had also represented folks in Lytton to build back to a newer standard rather than like for like, which is the traditional insurance approach. So regulatory change and practice change is needed on the private sector side too, in order to unlock some of these opportunities. But one of the things I just want to reemphasize that's really hopeful about this project in Lytton is the number of builders who have come forward and said, we'd really like to learn how to be able to deliver fire resilient housing, and we'd really like to learn how to deliver net zero housing. So the capacity building legacy in the interior of BC, where these risks are incredibly high, will be a great dividend and legacy of this project. And it's pretty consistent, especially the factory built component. I'll just give a little shout out to a side project I've been a part of. The Housing and Climate Task Force released a blueprint 2 weeks ago now that you can find at housingandclimate.ca/blueprint, that emphasizes the need for factory-built housing to rise to the housing crisis and the supply challenge in a climate-smart way and at appropriate scale, and for serious overhaul to building codes so that it's not an option to build fire smart and fire resistant in high risk areas. It's a requirement. So these things should be coming from a regulatory standpoint, not just from a financing standpoint. But I'll give you one other quick example before I turn back to the minds on the panel here for some more open-ended questions. And it's a project that we're working on in Alberta, where there's a workforce housing project outside of Calgary that we will potentially be the finance partner for the construction and the mortgage on that, and then also the insurer, so that we can link the benefits of building that structure to a more fire resistant standard into the long-term benefits of not just more affordable, but in many cases, in some of these high-risk areas, even attaining insurance is becoming a challenge. And so it's good long-term risk management for anybody building something new in one of these higher risk areas to build it to a higher standard. But the first impediment is, well, there's an incremental cost to that. So we're trying to create an internal financing mechanism in that case for new construction. So again, seeking to find new financial mechanisms and practices that reward those who build right, while the regulatory floor moves to make sure that we're not building high-risk structures in high-risk areas into the future. So a lot of moving pieces here, but that just unlocks creativity and innovation. So maybe a question back to the group. What's the first step you'd recommend to other municipalities who are early on in their journeys? Folks who haven't thought about this that much yet. Where should they start?
I feel like I can Oh, sorry, I'll let Shannon
No,
go.
Her hand went up a little bit sooner. So let's go to Shannon and Eva.
That would be the good first choice. No, I was just gonna kind of reiterate, like understanding the landscape and like the work that others are doing already that might be in your community or in your province or region. There's so much overlap of effort, unfortunately, because so many people are trying to work in this space that it's very unlikely that you wouldn't find something that was useful just from an initial search. And just reaching out and having conversations and learning from people that have maybe done something similar to what you might want to do would be really important. And then some of that foundational work of really understanding your risks and how you feel you should go about prioritizing working on them.
As if you're the perfect segue into what I was going to say, Shannon. Like we've done this before. I think it's really important at the land doing what and who has done that hard work of triaging resources, right? So we have these regional climate service providers across the country. We've got, Uranus in Quebec and Climate Atlantic in the West, the Ontario Resource Centre in Ontario, Climate West Prairies, and PCIC, the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. These are groups that are meant to help municipalities and organizations within their jurisdictions figure out what those first steps are. So all of them have help desks. All of them are waiting to be reached out to. So I think that's a great place to go to somebody who's already done that aggregating to say, okay, what are you looking to do? Do you want to understand a risk? Are you looking for a solution? And then they can help you travel that path. If you're looking to understand risk, at what scale do you have to understand risk? You don't necessarily need to go down the hundreds of thousands of dollars, super detailed and technical PIVC route if you're looking to understand broad community risks. If you're looking to understand risks from a socioeconomic and equity perspective, there are different resources for that. And all those organizations can help you navigate that and exist only to help you navigate that. So I would say, please remember to reach out to them. They exist for that purpose. And then I think once you're at that stage, naturally you can guess, I'm going to hustle the resources we created through this project, which are meant to take you from, I have some ideas, how do I get to from a long list of ideas about stormwater ponds and, emergency evacuation routes, and how do I create something that I can pitch to someone? And that someone might be your own council, but that someone might be an external financing group or an external funder. So really start to think about, how do I position what I want to do through the lens of someone with the money to help me do it? And be willing to be flexible in how you position your project and what information you give about your project to that someone who might have the funds required to help you bring it to life.
Well, those are great answers. And I just threw another link in the chat for the Climate Atlas, which is a great way to see, what the projected hazards will look like into the future, just as a starting point for folks. And then all the other resources, of course, that Eva's compiled at ICLEI are fantastic, and FCM has some great resources too. And you can call us if you're not sure. You can call us at Cooperators and on the resilience investing side and see if there's something we can work together on. So that's as close to a commercial as I can muster. But there are a number of other questions in the chat here about Indigenous engagement in both the financial models and mechanisms, and then specifically in Lytton, whether there were opportunities to, because there is an Indigenous a nation right adjacent to, really nested in, and also lost many structures, was impacted by the fire. So I think it's a great question. I think it actually presents some really interesting opportunities for collaboration across, all four orders of government: Indigenous, municipal, provincial, and federal. So open-endedly, reflections from the group on examples or opportunities for Indigenous partnership. And maybe start, Paul, with the lens from Lytton.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the Lytton case. So the program that both Pacifican and ultimately our financing program is available. Again, it's kind of defined by geography. So to the extent that those boundaries move into into various Indigenous territories, they're absolutely open to taking advantage of those opportunities. In the case of Lytton, there was, as I understand it, separate activities that took place in some of the areas that were specifically targeted to Indigenous communities that had lost some some of their homes in the same wildfire. And so we, in this case, designed it to kind of be open to everyone, but also acknowledging that there was already activities going on, on that side that were already being covered. But I look, from our standpoint, we really looked at this project as facilitating, choice of individual choice. So again, the idea is, let's not make challenges like financing a barrier to otherwise taking action that is climate positive. So I don't think that really has a lot of barriers there.
Maybe I'll just add that in British Columbia, there are a number of examples coming together at the almost landscape management side of things, particularly with respect to wildfire risk reduction. So whether it's fuel removal or whether it's prescribed burning activity and cultural burning activity delivered by and for Indigenous communities in their own proximity of their structures and settlements and key infrastructure, but also within their traditional territory, so that with the benefit of both traditional knowledge and the best science, are there opportunities to actually manage risk within the landscape. Now, that's more on the adaptation resilience service provision side of things than the infrastructure side of things, but they are related, because if you can undertake activities that reduce or manage risk on a programmatic basis, that may help optimize either the need or the efficacy of changes to infrastructure or buildings, for example, that unmanaged risk would require. And you might still need to do the same upgrades to harden infrastructure to these risks, but the likelihood of them being put to the test is lower, and it's sort of a combined effort. And I think there's phenomenal opportunity for that in many parts of the country, but there seems to be a tremendous amount of leadership that we're very interested in British Columbia at the moment. So we'll have a little bit more to say about that in the coming months. So stay tuned. But agree with the premise of the question that there's huge opportunities and imperatives for partnership with Indigenous governments, organizations, and businesses in this space. Eva?
There's another project that we're involved with, which is around it's being led by First Nation, and it's around the rerouting of a waterway. And I think there's two things in that. One is it's led by the nation itself. So they're designing with engineers being brought on what the rerouting of this creek looks like to avoid flooding. And it involves the creation in that rerouting of a traditional medicine and cultural garden that is growing, sage, as well as tobacco and other plants that have cultural value. So I think there's two pieces there. There's one, learning that it's led by the nation itself, and two, that the way it's being paid for leaves room for these indirect, not necessarily solely related to adaptation, benefits that are of huge importance from a reconciliation and decolonization perspective. And Don, if you'll allow me, there's another question in here around program-related investors that I just wanted to touch on, which for those that are program-related investors are generally philanthropic investors. So foundations that, the question is around whether we're seeing foundations and other philanthropic organizations come into this space. And I think the quick answer is yes, but slowly. Climate and even climate-related action in municipalities is coming onto the radar of more and more foundations in Canada. It's been on the radar of more US foundations. We haven't typically seen that in the infrastructure space, albeit in the implementation space. And I think broader adaptation and resilience implementation is maybe the gateway to investing into hard infrastructure by the large family foundations and other foundations in Canada. So I think it's a slow entry, but we're already seeing some demonstrated leadership by some of the family foundations in Canada. I'm sure, Don, you and Paul might have more insight on that.
Well, and I think where there's been quite a bit of leadership and there's some great activity in the chat here around nature-based solutions. The foundations have been a little more present in that space, and some of the work that the Natural Asset Initiative has led in this space is going to be key. And we've done a little bit of thinking with them about how private finance might be able to support nature-based solutions where they clearly have efficacy in flood risk management, for example. And I think there's a larger thematic question here, which is, brittle versus truly resilient solutions, and what's adaptive and what's potentially maladapted. There's a new book out on this that I was just looking at the other day, where the example was hard infrastructure with a lot of concrete was kind of the answer in the 20th century, and then now that infrastructure is becoming overwhelmed after having provided false senses of security for folks behind it, whereas nature-based solutions that can absorb a lot more energy from severe weather and disruption and recover themselves if they're or perhaps be repaired with human intervention and cultural intervention, may be more resilient for the long term than hard infrastructure solutions. So understanding the role of nature-based solutions is key here, and that's where there's I think been some more philanthropic support. So I hope those things will join at some point, because the knowledge of how to build truly resilient and more nature-based flexible solutions that are themselves adaptive will be critical to this, because we probably can't harden our way out of all of these challenges with brittle infrastructure, though in some cases that's the best answer in the meantime, where people are a little bit too close to the hazard. But there's this issue of maladaptation and false sense of security too. So there's all to say there's a lot of complex factors to juggle here. In a way, this is more challenging than decarbonization, because that has one clear goal. This has many issues that have been touched on in this, just to start to wrap things up, mindful of time, which are, how to finance it, how to manage risk over time, how to manage variable and uncertain risk over time. And, often the definition of success here is avoiding something, which gets hard to measure and put attribution around for financial models and incentive models, but not impossible, because the science is strong, and this is where insurers have a critical role to play, because understanding and pricing that risk is something that insurers do every day. But everyone is already being impacted by changing climate in every community from coast to coast to coast, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And increasingly, some of the folks who are most at risk are racialized folks living in our cities in substandard housing, exposed to heat, exposed to extreme weather. And so those equity concerns, I'm glad, were a part of this discussion too. So it is a lot to wrap your head around, but it's all the things that municipalities and local leaders need to manage at the best of times. And that's why we're grateful for your time and engagement to be a part of this today. And I just want to thank Ewa, not just for today, but for the deep partnership over many years, and with cooperators, and on resilience and sustainability in our communities, but particularly for the work on these financing resilient infrastructure project materials that have been circulated, to Shannon for helping teach us what will work in an Atlantic Canadian large urban and rural sort of municipality, because she's got everything from coastline to big city to rural communities and everything in between, from forests to swamps. And so Halifax is actually a great sandbox for us to work in, and Shannon's an amazing partner. And Paul always brings a lot of pragmatism to these discussions, which is always really helpful. So gratitude to each of our panelists here, and I'll turn it back to Evan to close.
Thanks, Don. Thank you also to each of our panelists today. Thanks to Ewa, Shannon, and Paul. And thank you also to the cooperators for your collaboration and support for today's session. There will be a recording of today's session that will be posted to fcm.ca in the coming days. So please, please, please feel free to share it as a resource with all of your colleagues. And if you enjoyed today's session, please join us for our next collective conversation taking place during a special luncheon on June 6th at noon at FCM's annual conference in Calgary. Thanks, everyone. Be well.